All right, I'm Sasha Nicole.
And I'm Star.
And I'm Dr. T.
This is Amerikan Therapy, the definitive podcast for all things Black mental health. And we have a big show today. Star, tell them what we're talking about.
All right now, so this is a big one. So today we're talking justice reform in the age of coronavirus, a woman's perspective. So the locked up, but with the women. So let's go.
Yeah, locked up, as Akon said.
Yes, yes. One of my favorite songs.
We have an amazing guest today. We're really excited to have her. We thank her. Topeka K, who is the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries. And so, we try to cut down the bio, but I want to read the whole bio because it's important for everyone to hear what Miss Sam is actually doing. So
she's a big deal.
Yeah. So Topeka Sam, she was in federal prison. She witnessed firsthand the epidemic and disparity of incarceration on women, more specifically women of color. She felt the urgency to bring the faces and voices of women in prison to the public in order to bring awareness to women's incarceration. After her release in 2015, in response to what she saw and learned in prison, she created the Ladies of Hope Ministries, an organization whose mission is to help disenfranchised and marginalized women transition back into society through education, entrepreneurship, spiritual empowerment, and advocacy. With Vanee Sykes, Topeka developed the vision for Hope House NYC. While they were incarcerated, Hope House NYC is a safe housing space for formerly incarcerated women located in the Castle Hill neighborhood of the Bronx. Shout out to the BX people. Topeka K. Sam is a 2017 Soros Justice Fellowship recipient. Her fellowship, the Probation and Parole Accountability Project, focuses on the broken and arbitrary probation and parole systems. Her op-ed, It's Time to Overhaul America's Broken Probation and Parole System, was published widely. She's also a 2015 Beyond the Bars Fellow and a 2016 Justice and Education Scholar, both at Columbia University. In December, in partnership with Grammy winner and activist John Legend's Free America, Bank of America New Profit, Topeka was named as one of 8 people for the first cohort of Unlocked Futures, which is an accelerator for social innovators who have been impacted directly by the criminal justice system. Additionally, she consults with Senator Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren on the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act. She's been a TEDx Mid-Atlantic presenter. And in 2017, she was one of the 3 women who met with Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Lee, Sheila Jackson, and 17 other members of the Democratic Women's Working Group, where she spoke with them about the realities faced by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. You can also hear her every Sunday at 9 a.m. She hosts the weekly show Last Mile Second Chances on SXM Urban Radio, channel 126, Sirius XM. And so you can read more about her, of course, on her website, Topeka Sam. She's a founding member of the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. And I think that's it. I've read it all. I'm sure
there's more though, because so we kept hearing your name. We just did a show last week, right, with the Pivot, the ladies of the Georgetown Pivot program. So then we started hearing these stories about women in incarceration. And we really hadn't heard much about, we know our sisters are locked up. I've worked in the prison system before, and it surprised us, even last week's show, how normal, quote unquote, air quotes, normal, the women, especially the Black women that we were seeing in the prison system, they were people just like us. So we want to know, can you share that story, because our audience is probably mostly middle-class Black people that may have no idea that, especially for women, these are really just you, me, Sasha, Dr. T, that just happen to be locked up because of, circumstances.
Right. So one, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm incredibly excited. And yes, that bio is an old bio. So there has been a lot that has happened and changed since that point, but it's all good. No need to toot my own horn. God does enough. But I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to share my experience and to speak to the middle class audience. I was raised in an upper middle class neighborhood in Manorville, Long Island. So in that neighborhood, we were the only Black family in our neighborhood. My parents wanted to get us out of the city where they were raised, both in Harlem and the Bronx, and they felt that taking us to white suburbia would giving us all those opportunities. So outside of me or us being the only Black students in school, we would go to Harlem on the weekends and to Harlem School of the Arts and have our piano lessons, dance lessons, me, flute, my brother, a violin, another cello, one percussion, My father wanted us to be the, I guess, the Jackson 5 quartet or whatever. But my parents also owned a Carvel franchise in Brooklyn and Utica Parkway, and Utica and Eastern Parkway for over 20 something years. And then from there, they opened restaurants in Harlem. And so while growing up, I mean, of course, I knew I was a Black girl. My mother made sure I knew that. But those were my friends, right? These are people I grew up with, people that I was around. And it wasn't until it was time for me to go to college, actually, when I chose to go to an HBCU, Morgan State University, for obvious reasons. You know, I got to the age where I wanted to know more about who I was and wanted to be around kids who looked like me. And so I get there, and it was a complete culture shock. So though super excited that I'm like, wow, all these beautiful Black people that are like me, you know, they're like, oh, you think, what they tell me? Oh, I'm pretty to be dark skinned. You know, I talk like I'm white. Some people even said, like, you think you're better than being Black. And I'm like, what is going on? I remember calling my mother, like, what is happening? And then she started telling me about like colorism and internalized racism. And I began to learn more about that, but still trying to find an identity and trying to find a way of connectedness and belonging, because I so desperately wanted to be recognized from a community that I was a part of, right? I'm like, look, I'm one of you. Like, you know, I'm your sister. Don't say that. And so as a result of that, I began to kind of go off the campus and look for other, I mean, most kids, you get away from your parents and away from, you know, isolation, if you will, in suburbia into the city. So now I'm in Baltimore City, and I'm around, you know, guys who are fast. You know, yeah, my parents had a Mercedes, and everybody's friends had Mercedes and Jaguars, but now I'm around Black guys who have big cars. And, you know, I'm around people who have credit cards growing up. Now people have cash money, and everything is looking just completely different. And now it's exciting, you know, and I'm like, wow. So my parents had a place in Harlem. I can laugh about this now in retrospect, but my parents had a place in Harlem. And so when I got there, I represented Harlem. I was not from Long Island. I was from Harlem. And so therefore, yeah, I knew everything that was going on in the street, when really I was as green as the grass in Mandeville and didn't know anything. But I began to learn, and people felt comfortable because they thought I was from Harlem. And so they began to share different things that were going on. And I would just listen and learn. And eventually, you know, I'm dating guys who are selling drugs, and, you know, I'm like, well, they can do it, I can do it better. And so I think I can do it better. And so I find myself selling drugs, and it's the cycle. And while going to school, building my career, I end up being division chairperson for Amtrak for New York and DC. I had a business, and I wanted to start another business. And I'm up in my 30s, and I find myself arrested and locked up in Virginia as a part of a federal drug conspiracy. And so, yeah. And so I'm there now. And I'm like, my friend's like, you're not like those people.
So wait, when you, even as you were the division chair, were you still selling drugs as a division chair?
I would look, I'm like, I'm gonna be honest, I was. You know, I was
streams of income.
Right, and not that you know, here's the thing, you know, let's be clear, like, I knew right from wrong. I was raised in a church. You know, I was talking to my mother the other day, and I was laughing. I'm gonna share this. And we were just talking about like how people make choices and decisions, and you think that you're so smart and so fast and so slick. And how I'm like, yeah, Ma, I had 3 phones, right? So I'm thinking I have the work phone, my personal phone, and then the back phone. I was like, but I got arrested with all 3 phones. So I was like, so how smart was I really? You know, I mean, again, I can laugh about this. I talk freely about it all the time with my mom. But, you know, I was like, how, you know, smart did I truly think I was, when in fact when I was arrested, I had all 3 phones in my possession, you know? So I can laugh again. You know, this is 5-7 years ago now. Actually 8 years ago now. So through that experience, when I got there, and my friends are like, you know, don't talk to them. You're not like them. We're going to make sure you get out of here. And so my family, friends are in court waiting to find out what my bail is. People have deeds to their homes, you know, cash, credit cards, like whatever it takes, we're going to make sure she gets out. And the judge is like, you're a drug queen pin and the threat to society and no bail. And so at this point, I'm like, well, I thought I was coming home, but I'm not. And I realized that I'm going to be sitting here and begin to understand the legal process and what's happening at this particular time. Because I wasn't a flight risk. It was none of these things. My case was actually jurisdictional entrapment. There were no drugs in my case. It was a sting operation by the feds. And so all of these things were, things that were around and surrounding my case, but understanding, as time went on as a Black woman, in the Fourth Circuit, in Virginia, that if I tried to fight my case, I would have been looking at 20 years. But while I went back and understood again that I was going to be there, I started going to like NA and AA classes because I thought that people use drugs because they wanted to use drugs. And it was this idea for me because I didn't have anyone in my family that I knew closely who had substance misuse issues. I was taught that you don't use drugs, they're bad for you, and this is what you don't do. And so I thought if people are using them, it's because that's their personal choice. And as I began to ask the women, and there was a woman who told me that her father had been raping her and gave her heroin and told her to take the heroin and the pain would go away.
Oh my God.
And there was another woman who said, well, the only time she was able to spend time with her mom was when they smoked crack together. And as I began hearing these stories and understanding that they didn't have a choice, especially when you think about the harm, my father, he just passed earlier this year. My parents were together 56 years, until the day that he passed. And knowing what a great man that he was and how he protected us and me. And to think that someone's father would actually cause that type of harm to them and then give them drugs to continue to misuse them and abuse their body was completely heartbreaking for me. And so at that particular time, I said, well, I continue to fight this case. I had access to resources to do so. But in the end, I was like, spiritually convicted, understanding the harm that I had caused. And I decided to plead guilty. And so I did. And because I was. And that was my way of making amends for the harm that I had caused for years. However, I just want to be clear by saying that, I do understand based on my work and through that experience, the criminalization of women and women of color. And I do know that while I was there, the judge said because of my education and because of the family and things that I came from, that I should have known better. And I do know that if I was a white woman, that I would not have served any jail time. So, and I do know that, prison didn't change me. It was the women that I met that did. And so it's important to, give that context that though in my situation and circumstance, it was completely different than what many others are, but the majority of women who are incarcerated are there because 85% of them are mothers and left as primary caregivers of dependent children. Most women are being criminalized for poverty, for their color, for their gender, and for lack of resources and opportunity in education. That over 95% of women are reported survivors of sexual trauma and violence, and they do not have access to resources to help heal them through that. And so it shows up in different ways. And then you also have over 95% that are reported substance misuse issues, and also have mental health issues. And so when you compile all these things in marginalized communities, when there are not resources to heal the trauma that was past inflicted upon them, it shows up in different ways. So I think like for the context, right, of the audience that's listening, and let's be clear, as a person that came again from an upper middle class that understood, that had resources, that technically I did not have to sell drugs in order to survive, right? My reason for getting engaged in that particular lifestyle was to find a sense of connectedness, of belonging, and I found myself buying into rhetoric that was already perpetuated about people of color. And so, and buying into what the community said. But there were many other people who have the same story as I do. Some people didn't get caught. My mother says, and my mentor, Reverend Dr. Moody, but by the grace of God, there go I. So, there are things, but we do know that women of color are actually hit even more so in this system than any other. In the last 2 decades, there's been an 800% increase on the incarceration of women. There has been in the last year, a report came out from the Sentencing Project that women are actually being sentenced to life at double the rate of men today. and the fact that there are 1.3 million people, women specifically, that are actually entangled in the criminal legal system. And so to your point, we're not talking about it, but while decarceration efforts are happening, while there are things happening around reduction of prison and prison populations, women and the incarceration rate of women are steadily increasing because we're not paying attention.
So you make a there's two things, but the first thing before we pivot to the realization of how women, especially Black women, are being criminalized is the mental health component. And Dr. T, weigh in here, is that when I think about one thing that you triggered when I was listening to your story is that you were looking for a sense of belonging. And there were, you know, and I remember there was a boy I was smitten with in Druid Park and Druid Hill, whichever, I don't even remember, but I just remember he was fine. I was willing to do anything. But Dr. Tino said, when we do things sometimes on the basis of the pain that we are in, because for me, you know, I know that I have often gotten caught up with certain people, certain situations, certain drugs based off of the pain that I was feeling. And no one had ever made me do those things. And I know better in some of the decisions that I've made. But how does the pain become so unbearable that it causes us to think or react in ways that we know make decisions that go against us? So it's like, how do we work to overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, so everybody's pain is different, but everybody's pain is real. And anytime you're in pain, I mean, if you stub your toe, your mind immediately goes to, how do I make this stop? And if making this stop means being with a man that I know is not good for me, going to places that I know is not good for me, using substances that I know are not good for me, but they're going to temporarily ease that pain, is just a biological drive to do that. The ultimate goal should always be to heal the pain, but sometimes we're not in a position to heal the pain, and healing takes time. No matter what kind of injury you have, a broken bone or an emotional injury, it takes time to heal. And so sometimes we just want that quick fix. That's why we eat too much. That's why we smoke too much. That's why we use drugs, because we want a quick fix to ease that pain. Or, you know, wanting a sense of belonging is normal, but going beyond and above and doing anything to get that sense is where, again, you start to, no matter how smart you are, your brain is still wired the way that everybody else's brain is. And it wants to feel good, and it wants to feel like it belongs, and it wants to feel like it matters. And so you'll put yourself in situations that, if any day you looked at on a piece of paper, you know, because people, they do this for teenagers. They ask them, you know, what's the morally right thing to do? They look at the piece of paper, they read it, they give the right answer all the time. And then they go outside and they do something completely different, right? So even though we know the right things to do and we know what good choices are, the power of our own pain causes us to compromise our own values.
Yeah, and I want to just add to that, you know, when we're living in that pain, we don't even recognize that it's pain, right? Like, it becomes a way to survive. And what I learned was, you know, I didn't realize that I was struggling. And this sense of connectedness, of belonging in the moment, I didn't know even how to articulate what it was that I was feeling, right? I just know I came from being one of the most popular people in school to now being in an area that I feel that I'm being shunned away. And I'm not understanding why, because I'm the same person. And now I'm around people that look like me, and something that I've always yearned for. But I've received the feedback differently. And though I had friends in college, let's be clear. And, you know, who are great friends and friends of mine even today. But it was whatever it was that I was looking for in that moment, even as a young woman, as we grow, as we evolve, as we change and develop into becoming who we are going to become. Those are some of the things that we face. And I learned that, you know, yes, people want to heal, but sometimes they don't know what healing is, specifically in our community, right? Like, you know, when you are a victim of sexual trauma or violence, a lot of times you're told to pray. We don't talk about it, especially that if it happens within the family. We don't share about it. We deal with it within closed doors, and we try to keep it moving. And so and it's so generational, so that it's kind of like a normal thing, though you don't understand and realize that this is not right, though innately it doesn't feel good. You know that because you're told not to talk about it, that then you begin to self-medicate with other things that are making you feel good, because you don't know you can go to a therapist. You're told that if you go to a therapist that you're crazy. People go to therapists are crazy. You don't need to go. And so it's these ideologies that have happened over many, many decades. I believe that it's changing now. We're going to therapists and seeking therapy, and mental health support is accepted. But it hasn't been for many years. I mean, let's be frank about it, right? And honest. But I think that as we move forward, it's incredibly important to understand that, you know, of course, we all fall short of the glory of God. We all make poor choices. No one, you know, I'm quoting the Bible, I was talking about it earlier, but, you know, there's no righteous man, not even one. So there's not anyone who can come and say that they have lived a just life their entire life. We've all made bad choices. Some may be more, you know, a little bit more out there than others, like myself. Others may have made choices. You know, some people did things that I would never do, you know, but that was their choices. But I think that
we all raised our hand on that one.
we move to grow and just to be better to each other and within our community, that I think that it's important that as people are transitioning back into the communities from prisons and jails, looking for support, that we are embracing each other in a way that shows love and gives and affords opportunities for healing for everyone.
But you know, Topeka, in your story, and I think Sasha, because Sasha and I are such good friends for so long, I think we both hear the same thing. Like, I'll give, like, I grew up in a decent, really well family, but yet, I mean, I think there's something there beyond just even the pain and finding healing. And like what I hear is this something that's exciting about the streets, that's exciting about doing things that are fast paced. I'm not going to give my story because, you know, but like, and I will give an example of like, I chose to go, and I used to be a barber. I went to North Carolina A&T. I went to college. You know, I always throw A&T in here. Any pride. But you know, that was my way of being like in the streets, but not in the streets that much. And I remember as a barber seeing young women that was hustling and, you know, or around hustlers or whatever. And there is like just a real excitement about being in that space and that lifestyle, if you will. And so like, that's something that I don't know, like, I don't want to miss that piece of it, because I know me and Sasha, I see you over here smiling. Like, that's something that we don't talk about, especially in middle class, upper middle class families. Like, it is exciting especially when you're not from that lifestyle, to kind of like, it's like playing in the zoo or something, like, oh, look at this. This is crazy. But
I mean, that's the thing, right? Like,
I'm being real.
I mean, right. I mean, keeping it all the way real. You know, the fact is, if you come from, you know, an environment where it's not that, right? You know, I came from, I'm going to school. I was a great student. I was captain of every team. I was always ambitious. President of every club. I was even president of the Spanish club. Didn't even speak Spanish, but I was that type of child. And so from there, you know, I excelled. I was a pianist, a prodigy at the age of 5. I was self-taught, and then they gave me piano lessons. I mean, it was like all of these things, but I'm having to practice, you know, an hour each day for my flute and piano after going to do my sports and whatever other extracurricular activities and education. So there was huge structure. Not that it was bad. It was what was my life and what my parents built for us, because they understood what the world looked like outside of where we were. We just didn't. And so I think any child who goes from one environment to another, that is completely different, right? When I was living on campus and I was on campus, I was good. I moved out because I wanted my own apartment, and I just started to hang out. My friend was like, girl, you need to come to DC. Howard University is over there, and you need to hang out over here. And as I started hanging out, and now you go from getting one type of attention now to another type of attention. You know, you were told you're not supposed to have sex until you're married. That's what I was told, right? My parents were together my whole life. So I'm thinking this is the way to be. And now I'm getting levels of attention that I didn't have before. So it's all of these things. And some people aren't necessarily ready for that. I was trusted by my parents because I could make the right decisions when I was around them, but I did not have the level of emotional intelligence that allowed me to operate in the world alone at that time. You know, at 44, I can say that. But at 18, being that was the first time I was away from my family in a whole nother state, and I felt like, hey, I don't have to check in. They don't know if I'm home or not. They don't know, you know, I could answer the phone and I'm like, okay, they're not going to call back. And so now it becomes this way of behavior, and it starts to feel good because, I mean, the bottom line, when, you know, the definition of criminal thinking is doing something wrong and feeling good about it. So it's not even like, you know, you begin to have these behaviors because it's different. And, you know, again, some people like me, my mother said as a child, I was the type of person that said, Topeka, don't touch that, it's hot. Touch it with my right finger, I get burnt. Touch it with my left finger, I still get burnt. I touch it with my right elbow, I still get burnt. Like, I'm always trying to find a way, even though somebody told me it was hot, I'm still trying. Now, somebody say it's hot, I'm not even doing that. But then I did. So, you know, it's this idea of, you know, I mean, we can't, I can laugh at all of this now because it's about growth and evolution. You know, in all, you know, sincerity and seriousness, though, you know, you can't, we are going to go through phases and stages in our life. Some of us have, and I'm not the doctor, so I don't know, but some of us have this thing in our brain, you probably know the terms, that will tell us, okay, no, right, stop. You know, you see the red flag, or you see, you know, don't go. You see the light shining. Some of us, like myself, would always be like, okay, I can see it, but that's not going to happen to me because I'm smarter. You know, I can go around this way. I can do this thing. So yeah, it feels exciting when you're living that life until it doesn't, right? And some people's thresholds for pain, for suffering, for any of these things is higher than others, right? That's why they say some people, I can go out for drinks with my friends, and some of them can drink and drink and drink and drink and still seem as if they are cognizant, you know, because
how can we, as Topeka said, when just mentioning what are some ways that we can pay attention to those signs more when we're seeing that, okay, this is wrong, or okay, I'm feeling this way. Like, is there something that we can do where we can, you know, I always say it's tough battling your own mind. You know, I've always, you know, mentioned how my biggest enemy has always been my mind. You know, is there something that we can do to help with that construct of what we're feeling and what we're thinking?
Yeah, so two things. First, I want to say and kind of remind everyone that some people end up in jail because they're thrill seeking and excitement, but a lot of women, they're trying to meet a need. They're trying to take care of their children. They're making decisions that they know are not in their best interest or in their children's best interest, but they got to make a way out of no way.
Yep.
Right. And so there's a wide spectrum, as we talked about last week, a wide spectrum of reasons. And we don't want Black women to be pigeonholed into any one of those reasons, but to understand that from all of the different depths of backgrounds that we come from, we end up in the same system that treats us unfairly.
That's right.
Right? Whether the crime was a petty crime or a more significant crime, the odds are stacked against us. So what do we do to answer Sasha's question to try to help us avoid being in situations where we're going to be treated unfairly? We know it's not in our control. So yeah, I mean, Star is probably the best person to answer this, because the thing that is really trying to help people right now be aware of what's going on is mindfulness, right? You'll hear this in all different kind of ways. And mindfulness doesn't mean meditation, doesn't mean it means being aware of what your body is telling you and what your body is saying to you. Now, the reality is, for many Black women, that's a luxury, right? To be able to slow down, to be able to take care of ourselves, to be able to listen to our own bodies, the red warning signs that are telling us danger, danger, Will Robinson, you know, that are telling us rest, that are telling us all the things that our body is designed to tell us. It's a luxury to have the opportunity to sit down and listen to ourselves. We, as middle and upper middle class women, we have created that space, and we're still struggling to try to do it. But there are many Black women who that just feels like a luxury. And that's just the God's honest truth. But it doesn't mean it's not important. One of the things I teach about when I teach self-care is that if you don't put your oxygen mask on first, the stress will kill you. And so if you don't take care of yourself, even in those most detrimental situations where it feels like there's no way out, you eventually are going to do more harm than good. And I think that's what happens in the instance of incarcerations, where they were trying for the right reasons to do whatever, some Black women, or thrill seeking. But the thrill seeking is still, if you think about it, self-development, right? I'm trying to understand who I am, figure out my place in the world. I've been put on this one track, and I don't know if that's who I am. So let me try this track. Oh, this is a fun track. Oh, let me try this track. This is an even better track, right? So all of that is a part of our emotional growth and development that I think we take for granted. And some people, depending on, where they came from and the circumstances, that's a luxury. They just got to make it happen.
And I think that's a perspective in the Black community, because you say luxury, and you're absolutely right. And like, I teach a class with one of the largest Medicare providers in DC, and we're working to retrain our brain that that's not a luxury, it's a necessity, because you're just reacting. You can't respond appropriately to anything if your brain is still stuck in that flight or fight mode.
So Star, weigh in here to pivot the conversation and all the work that Topeka is currently doing in regards to the criminalization and why that is so. I mean, well, we know the why, but how, what are some initiatives, what are some things that's going on, and how we can move past, or attempt to try to move past this alarming rate that of women who are getting locked up and who are being sentenced unfairly.
Yeah, and one of the things, like, Topeka, we want to know from you. So we're getting ready to do a show with one of our representatives, congressional representatives, and we're building a reform. We're working on some reform work, more so reform, policing reform. But the justice piece has to be there when you talk about policing, because of you're sentenced, you're charged on the street, and then how you're sentenced in the courtroom. And so one of the questions that, like, as we're writing policy, like, I'll be honest, like, I'm struggling with, how do we connect the two? How do we make a clear connection? Because I can see it in my head as a Black person, but how important policing and prison reform are, especially for women and families. When women get sucked out of the family, the primary caregiver gets taken away. That's almost like creating a fast track for all the children in the family to be pulled into that pipeline. Like, can you create that connectivity? And what should we be asking Congress about for, as far as it's concerned with women in prison and women's reform in prison? Because we haven't heard a lot about that.
Okay, so, well, a few things. One, when you think about policing and you think about law enforcement in general, law enforcement not only stems from policing within our communities, but it's also corrections inside the prisons and jails. And when you think about what happened even to Sandra Bland while in custody, we need to make sure that we are connecting that law enforcement needs to be held accountable, and how we stopping the brutality and criminalization, and also, the kidnapping of our people, specifically women and girls. I would say, we've worked on legislation, dignity for incarcerated women, where we passed now 15 pieces of legislation nationally. And we were also able to get the dignity provisions in the First Step Act on the federal level, which ends shackling of women during child labor, making sure women have hygiene products free of charge to them, making sure that children are within a 500-mile driving radius of proximity to their parents, and also making sure that formerly incarcerated people have the right to go back inside of the prisons to help to train, develop, and give programming for people before they come home, because those of us who've been able to be successful know exactly what each other needs in order to be successful. Now, the best way to make that connectivity is exactly what we did. Those who have the lived experience need to be at the table and need to help in drafting the legislation. The reason why we were able to be so successful in passing that legislation is because there were women who had lived in prisons, women who have family members and loved ones who live in prisons, to come to the table to talk about what needs are needing to be met within their communities, both inside of prisons and outside of prisons, and teaching them how to draft and write legislation, teaching them how to get co-sponsors for bills, teaching them how to go and lobby and communicate legislative advocacy on both not only a federal level, but also their local levels as well. So I think, the best way of connectivity, what I learned through doing the specific legislative work and legislative advocacy work that I've done over the last few years, was getting families involved. Whether it was around mandatory minimums or changing sentencing laws, you bring families who are impacted. If it's about mothers, you bring the children who've lost their parents, or fathers. It's about the children who've lost their parents. If it's about women's incarceration and conditions of confinement, you bring women who've lived in prisons. If you think about policing and police brutality, you bring mothers and fathers who have lost their children to gun violence. And when you humanize, and when you let these elected officials know, like, hey, we are your constituents, right? I have the right to vote. I vote. I'm a voter. Since leaving federal prison, I have voted again. Before I went in, I voted, and coming home, I voted. And when you let them know that you know what your rights are to vote, they listen to you differently. And when you let them know that you have the power to organize and mobilize your community in order to do those things, they listen to you differently. And so, it's how do you also utilize and put forth your demands. I also think that it's important for us to begin to not only like the word to police, but that we help to support and take care of our own communities. We have, the over-policing. I see things every day, as I'm sure everyone in your listeners do, about how you have police that aren't from the community, that don't look like the community, that come in and they terrorize the community. And though there's an argument that why don't we have people from the community that are actually trying to apply for the police, but we also know that because we're criminalized and thrown in prison, and what happens where we can't apply for the police departments after and during post-incarceration is why we're not applying, and also the relationship to policing versus the community. But I do know that, every time I came in to see my grandparents, or the stories that I hear about from my parents, that the community took care of each other. They did not call the police. The lady next door, if the child was outside past a certain hour, then they would handle them. If they were disrespectful or did something wrong in school, they would handle it. And again, understanding that, so many of our families have been kidnapped and put in prison and jail, so children are left to fend for themselves today. I also know that that's not always the case. And there are people, even like myself, who may live in their building. And yes, thank God, I know who my neighbors are. Because I make that, and I make sure that I go to the meetings that are happening within my building, or join the community board of where I might own a home at, to be engaged and learn more that's happening. But I think that we need to educate, civically engage and educate our community, specifically the young people, on what it means as it relates to political advocacy, and understanding that process, and also helping them to encourage them and each other to run for public office in our local municipalities, because that's where most of the change needs to happen. The federal level is great, but that's not where the change happens. The change happens locally. And unless we're educating each other on that portion of it, because let's face it, before I went to prison, I used to vote, yes, but I always voted for the president. And when it came to the local elections, I would vote for either the Black woman, if she was there, or the Black person, or the person whose name I saw most on the sign. I may not even know what they did. I didn't understand that I need to be voting for the district attorneys. I didn't understand that I needed to vote for the judge. And so I would see a name and it would basically be processed by elimination. And I can say that based on my research and also talking to many people around this country, they did the same thing. So how do we then educate our communities to understand how incredibly important the electoral process is, and to know what your voting rights are, because you have been disenfranchised does not necessarily mean that you cannot vote. What is the right that you need in order to restore your votes? And also, how do you then engage other people who have the right to vote if you can't vote yourself?
I think that what Topeka is saying is so true, because when you have been historically disenfranchised and historically oppressed, you don't even realize how it affects you and your choices. And so, you know, we think about voting and we hear all of these campaigns about voting. And my daughter here in DC, they can vote when they're 16. And so I told her, you're 16, you register to vote. And when I first moved to DC, you got your little voters book and it had a little bit of description of the candidates, this, that, and the other. This book this year, it just had a copy of what the ballot was going to look like. So she was like 16, has, you know, no idea, no choices. She's like, do I vote for this? Do I vote for that? And I was just shocked at how little voter education was provided. And, you know, they can see when she registers that she's a first-time voter because she's only 16. So they don't have anything progressive. And this is a progressive city that we live in, right? They don't have anything progressive that on the website for first-time voters or information about, you know, this, that, or the other. And so, and I'm trying to be an informed parent and help her. And so I can imagine we actually talked about maybe you can do a service project at your school, because how many of your 16-year-old friends do you think even registered? And because so many places in the country, you have to be 18. So it's like the education around our right to vote is just non-existent.
And you know, one thing, Dr. Royce, I'm glad you brought up your daughter, because the one thing I've noticed, like, you go to these forums and like even candidate forums and things, and I will see a lot of white people with white children or other people with other children. And that's part of like home education, if you will. And I'm sure the parents are guiding, you know, like, oh, we're Republican, we're Democrat, whatever. But like you see them engaging and bringing their children in. This makes me laugh because I'm in the local NAACP, and one of our white members, and I thought about it, I said, hold up, the only person who brings their children to the actual NAACP meeting is our white member, like our handful of white members, and the only person, like all this room full of black people. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's not even part of typically most of our households to really talk about and in depth of like, okay, this is what the judge, this type of judge, one, do you even know what type of judge seat that the person is running for? And certainly, do you know their record? And that stuff is hard to get anyway. So I'm glad that you're having that conversation, but it appears that other households outside of our community are already doing that. That's
And I would say a lot of times, you know, unfortunately, you know, all of that is by design, right? Like, because everything has been against us. We've been criminalized for just being Black, and who we are. And the fact that, you know, there's this idea, like, why should I vote? My vote doesn't count. You know, when you think about a lot of times, you know, how gerrymandering is happening, how, you know, redistricting is happening, how people are, where the prisons are actually, and I learned this when I was incarcerated, where we were in Danbury, the census came through and they would count us. And so they're counting us as a part of that district, because that also allots how many electoral votes they get. But you don't know that. People don't know that. And that's why prisons are strategically built in certain areas, and why so many Black and brown people are taken from the communities, and why that's happening, because then the numbers, you're disenfranchised, you can no longer vote, but then you're getting those counts in that area where it is usually rural and usually white and usually Republican, right? So you think about that, you think about the fact that, okay, yeah, New York, we are a Democratic state, typically, right? So no matter where you vote, you're typically, whoever's running for the Democratic seat, they're gonna get it. So people are like, well, whether I vote or not, it doesn't matter, because that person is gonna win anyway. And in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really count, because when you're looking at certain, like a presidential election, places like New York, you know, it is what it is. But when you really think about it, that's why it's so incredibly important for us to educate our communities civically about what's happening on the local level, because that's where all the laws are changing within our neighborhoods and in our communities. And we don't look at it that way, because we have, and rightfully so, right, are tired of the fact that there are laws that are being written and laws that are not being enforced and implemented that are harming us more than helping us. But now I think that younger people like your daughter are becoming more engaged, understanding the process. You know, history repeats itself. So, you think about our Fannie Lou Hamers and those who fought for us and having the right to vote and things, and now everything that we're seeing in the public eye through social media and technology, people are getting activated in those same ways again. So I'm hopeful that our communities will engage more. It is disheartening, when you think about, well, here's the election and people are like, well, it's either, Trump or Biden, and which of the, the two evils is what I hear. But again, I implore people to understand that is one seat. And yes, that may be the president of the United States, but they have no power if the rest of the cabinet isn't in order. So if you are voting, for your Congress people, for your state representatives and senators, and all the way down to your, your assembly people and your public advocates, in order to make the laws change where you live, then, that's how you're able to really shift and move power. And then, hopefully all you ladies will run for public office and we'll have people in seats to do the things that we need to do to help remove oppression and poverty for women and girls, and give us more power and strength in our community.
Topeka, is there anything that we can do also to support some of the initiatives that you're doing? So when someone hears this and who says, I know someone who's currently in prison, or my mother or my sister, or whatever the case may be, or I feel directly impacted, or I relate to this and I want to help out in some way, but maybe they don't necessarily, know how to start or where to go. Is there certain ways where you would recommend for especially other young women who want to see, the narrative change for girls who look like them? What are some things that we could just advise them in doing beyond the local election standpoint? But are there certain organizations or certain initiatives that we can work with in making sure that we get the reform that we need? Because like Star said, I rarely hear people talking about women in prison at all. And so how do we start bringing that conversation up more? What are some small steps that we can also do besides our local officials? Like if you could just talk about some of the other stuff that you're working on.
Right. So, for one, what you're doing now, sharing your platform to raise awareness. And so other listeners can do that. Right now, we have access to building our own platforms, whether it be through, YouTube, IGTV, or Facebook Live, getting your viewers to be able to have conversations with women around incarceration or the issues, families that are impacted, children who have loved ones who've been incarcerated. I think, when we understand that 1 in 3 people in this country have had an incarcerated loved one, we understand that it impacts all of us. And being able to utilize that and not move in shame around this issue, right? It's so much shame that still moves around, hey, I've been in prison, or, my family member, my parent is presently incarcerated. People don't want to talk about it. So making safe spaces for people to share. And when you feel empowered to share your personal experience, whether it be you or a loved one, you'd be surprised the people that actually step out and speak out. I was at this event at the National African American Museum in DC last year, and this woman came up to me after I shared, and she was like, I never told anyone about it. So it was a huge corporate event. And she was like, but I go to visit my brother I have gone for the last 20 years to visit my brother in prison with my mother every other weekend. And she just cried because she felt like she could take a breath and share that with someone when she's living her life really in secrecy, right? Because those are hard burdens to carry. I think if people are interested in plugging in into knowing more about our work, they can visit us on our website, www.thelohm.org. They can follow us on social media at the LOHM across all platforms. My social media is at Topeka K Sam on all social media platforms. And not only are we just an organization that focuses on, again, women who are incarcerated, we look at all impacted women and girls. So whether you have lived in a prison yourself or you have a loved one who's lived in a prison, we are there to help. We do advocacy. We help to free people. We write motions to give clemency and compassionate release. We have 5 programs. We have a Hope House in the Bronx, but we also just purchased a house in New Orleans that just recently opened, and we're scaling that across the country for women in housing. We're getting into affordable housing so that when people who have convictions need a place to live, we can give them affordable housing units and beautiful new developments so they don't have to go back to neighborhoods that completely may be unhealthy for them. We also just partnered with Virgin Unite, where we're tapping into their B team of 450 corporations globally, where we are getting them to support second chance hiring and making sure that people with convictions, the 70 million people in this country who have criminal convictions, have an opportunity for a second chance for jobs. We have a food insecurity program. So if you're hungry, we partner with Whole Foods, Instacart, Wegmans, Fairway, and we give out fresh bags of food every single day, 5 days a week, to over 6 to 7 states right now. We have a speakers bureau where we train and develop women how to use their voice and also place them so they can get paid speaking engagements, so that their voices are valued, and being a public speaker is a career and a profession, and that you should be compensated accordingly and such. And we also are making sure that we're doing our advocacy around parole and probation. There's 4.7 million people currently entangled in the parole probation system. We're making sure that people know their rights, that people are building healthy relationships with probation officers so they are no longer over surveillancing and doing arbitrary things that are more hindrance to our community and to our loved ones. So they can tap in any of those many things that we do. We're also looking on developing a network of impacted women where they're going to learn how to draft and write legislation to end poverty and incarceration, whether it's housing, food insecurity, job security, entrepreneurship training and development, access to resources, financial literacy, and investment practices. So, you know, what we do know, as in order to end incarceration, you must end poverty. And in order to end poverty, you have to reinvest dollars into the communities that are most marginalized and into the hands of the people that need the most. And so we are doing our work through those lenses, and also partnering with other community-based organizations that are women of color, and formerly incarcerated women of color led across the nation, that also allows people to tap into other local organizations that they can feel fulfilled to help work and get the word out, and also support financially, because we cannot do this work without donations. So let's be clear on that.
All right, as we close this out, Topeka, we really appreciate everything that you've provided for us to take in. I think I only have one more small question before we close out, and that's just about the sentencing terms. And I know for you, and forgive me because I read and things like that, but you were able to not serve your whole prison sentence, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And because what we often see in this is that we will get sentenced for first-time offenses, drug crimes. I understand that the drug crime that you were sentenced for, you were doing things at a higher magnitude. However, I'm not quite sure if I'm convinced sometimes that those type of crimes deserve the magnitude of sentences that we as Black people get. And like you mentioned in the very beginning, a white woman could do the same thing, as we've seen in education, who, you know, will send their kid to a different school and get a slap on the wrist. And then a Black woman currently right now, who I believe got 5 to 7 years for that. You know, that unhinges it. Like, I just don't understand how, you know, and obviously that's the discrepancies that we have, but are there things that we can do, or what were you able to do in order to make sure that we can stop having these type of sentences for the crimes that aren't adding up to what we're being sentenced to?
So there's a few things. You know, my case was a federal case, and in federal case and on federal levels, there's something called the sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines were implemented with the 99 crime bill, because at one time there were no maximum sentence over 30 years. You only did a percentage of that time, and then you were eligible for parole. Clinton came in and they changed that. And when they changed that, it made mandatory minimum. So people did based on what was a conspiracy law. So like I said to you before, that though my case was jurisdictional entrapment, what happened was there were phone calls, recorded phone calls, and someone who stated that I was going to do this transaction, right? And so because they said that I was going to do this without there being any drugs involved, right, at all, that I was sentenced for the amount of drugs that I said I was going to purchase, not actually the amount of drugs that was purchased. So, you know, in my opinion, I'm like, you know, okay, I can see, yes, I was wrong. right? And yes, I had sold drugs before in the past, and that's what it was, in full transparency. However, when you look at most women who are presently incarcerated right now, they are incarcerated because of the conspiracy law on a federal level, which means that someone said they did something, or the fact that they would not testify or cooperate against their husband, their boyfriend, their friend, their partner. They end up getting hit with what's called the max. And so whoever cooperated ends up getting a time cut, or sometimes no prison time at all. And that woman ends up getting sentenced to life in prison because somebody said that over a certain amount of drug amount, over a certain amount of years, which equate to a certain dollar amount, is what this person had, which typically they didn't. So there's a sister in prison right now, Michelle West, for example, was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 50 years plus 10 years post-incarceration release for first-time nonviolent offense because her co-defendant, who actually committed the crime, testified, received full immunity, but implicated Michelle, who went to trial, and they decided to send her to prison forever. There's a sister, Bonetta Willis, who is in Alabama right now. She was a part of a FEMA fraud scheme. Now, her loss amount, that's the other thing. If you have a white collar crime in the federal system, the dollar amount is indicative of the sentence. So the loss amount, I think for her was $10,000, but every single person in her case said that she was the mastermind. Meanwhile, they said that she was developmentally delayed. Her judge is no longer on the bench. Her attorney has been disbarred, and she's sitting in federal prison now over 10 years with a sentence of 63 years for a first-time money crime. Because other people said that she did this. I mean, I have many, many names of many cases. And then you look on state levels, much of the same. There are even states that don't even offer parole. And when you think about women in categorized violent crimes, typically it's abuse of violence. It is an isolated event where they tried to protect themselves or reported it, and then they have to save themselves, protect themselves and their children. Someone gets harmed, they get life when that shouldn't have happened anyway. And there are all of these things. So the way that we change that, there's legislation that needs to be changed in order to do that. When you think about the drug laws, because that's what we talked about as a result of the drug war, that is federal legislation that has to change and has to pass. We're presently working on re-implementing parole. By re-implementing parole, it takes away the life sentences completely and allows people an opportunity who are presently in prison to go up for parole. We're also asking that all of the laws that they changed because they wanted to change them to solve the harm that they caused are now retroactive. Because there are new laws that come into place, right? And though they come into place, they do not have retroactivity. So the person like William Underwood, who is a father of my friends Ebony and Miko and Anthony Underwood, who's been sitting in prison for 30 years for a first-time nonviolent offense, cannot benefit from any new law passed because it's not retroactive. And so while people are no longer being sentenced to that lengthy sentence, and while people who are there after a certain date actually can benefit, he can't. And so you see all these laws passing, but yet you have not rectified the wrong that is caused, which is why they say systemic racism, while we're not getting things to the root of the problem. So what people need to do is advocate, contact their local elected officials, their Congress people, and urge that they change these laws. Make sure that they're working with organizations who are working on drafting legislation, so that way that can happen not only on federal level, get engaged in understanding what's happening on the local level, but outside of all of that, like, let's look at diversion programs. Let's look at opportunities where, though we want to decarcerate and get people out, we have to stop the flow of getting people into prison. And how do we look like, to your point earlier, Dr. T, that how you criminalizing people who are actually impoverished, right? So who is really to blame? If I have to steal diapers for my baby and milk to feed her, and I don't have the resources to purchase them, then who is the one to blame? Why am I being put in prison opposed to getting the opportunity and the resources so that I can take care of my family? So I think, I would also just implore people to understand that this is our issue, right? First of all, it's every Black and brown person's issue. but it's every American's issue around mass incarceration and the criminalization of people, specifically women and women of color. And that we must all take up on that issue. We must all make noise, right? While everyone is coming together in order to fight police brutality and all these other things that have been happening in the country, we cannot forget the Breonna Taylors and things that are happening within the construct, but their names are not actually being raised and lifted because they're women. And the flow of what's happening to women and girls that are going into prison. We did not talk about human trafficking and sex trafficking and how that is actually destroying our communities. You know, there's so many things that I'm sure we can talk about. Hopefully I'll be invited back again. But it's like, you know, it's just so hurtful, and that, you know, it cannot be just the woman who went to prison, right? Because we talked about therapy. I haven't even had an opportunity to unpack all of my trauma, right? Because I have to live it every single day, even while having conversations like this, in order to get people to understand the things that are happening with ability to help people who are less fortunate than them, and make sure that they have access to the resources that they need, that all of us once want, and give redemption and forgiveness, right? Like, judge ye not.
Wow. Thank you. Dr. T, go ahead and start closing us out. Topeka, we appreciate you tremendously. And Dr. T, what say you? What's some things you can add to this from a mental standpoint?
So I feel like this theme of repairing the social fabric is going to be my theme for 2020 on this show. And how it shows up today is we have to take care of each other as a community. And that means getting reconnected. You know, I don't want to use the big fancy word civic engagement, because it means things like going to the PTA meetings and making sure they're treating children fairly. It means volunteering to go help another mom who, you know, feels like something's happening to her kid at the YMCA, and she doesn't have anybody to support her when she has a meeting with the director of the center. Connecting with each other, supporting each other. If you're so inclined, don't just think of even city council. That there are a lot of entry-level opportunities to become involved in your community. Here in DC, we have neighborhood commissions where you might only need 40 votes to win to represent your neighborhood, and then you're going to have an impact on the policies and the practices in your community. There are local school advisory committees where you may not even need 10 votes. And most of the time putting your name on the ballot is guaranteed that you're going to get that seat. And doing things like that empowers us, and it heals us, and it helps us because we're helping ourselves and we're helping someone else. So we have to figure out very concrete ways that we can, with small amounts of effort, see a big change, because it'll help us and it'll help us help others. And then we'll start to feel better mentally as well.
Star, what say you? What's your two things? So
I got two things. I want to say two phones like Kevin Gates, but because of the phones, but anyway. So my two things for today are going to be, the first one is that we are our greatest resource. So this conversation, and I think every week it's gotten better, obviously, like this is year 2, and so it gets crazy good every week. But this week just really, I mean, Topeka is a font of knowledge, of action, knowledge plus action, which is really lethal, right? When you know something and then you go get up and do something about it, that's somebody that you want to be tapped into. So we are our greatest resource. And I think that reframing that sense of that, well, I don't know where to go, I don't have any resources. No, we have our resources. People like Topeka, we've got Google, so we can find each other now, and we've got all this social networking. So we're at each other's fingertips, because we hit Topeka on Instagram, and thank God she responded. I didn't think she would respond, but she did, and she is a font and a wealth of knowledge. And I know there's other Topekas out there. So we are our greatest resource. And then two, just, you know, this week has been, the last couple of weeks for me has been about the examination of, you know, we keep hearing about violence and the rioters and violence in our community as a response when we say, hey, stop being violent towards us. And so this week I've really focused on violence and like, what does that mean in our community? And so my last thing is around the violence of poverty and what that means and what that does and how that takes the dignity out of a community. And Topeka like brought it front and center. And so that like literally just snapped in my head around the violence of poverty and how we have been under the violence of poverty for over 400 years as a people up until this very second, and that we have to find a way to break free of it and then to ensure that it never seeps back into our community, because we are clearly brilliant and gifted and resourceful, but there's an active effort through like de jure segregation, through policy, to ensure that by and large we will be under the foot of the violence of poverty. So
awesome. I think I'd close out and just saying that, you know, similar to the show we had about the Georgetown Pivot Program, you know, there is a sense of compassion and empathy that we have lost for each other. And oftentimes I have found myself in positions that I never thought that I would be in. And I've even judged others in saying, and to what Topeka said in the very beginning, is that I too have very much thought nobody ever forced me to do drugs. And so my assumption, or my judgment more so, never thought about the people who might have been forced to do drugs, but only the people who did have a choice. And so we know, what we do know is that there is always an accountability measure in any regard. But there's also a measure where we have to have compassion and understand that there are certain things that can touch us. And when you get to a certain place where, you know, for me, my life, I lived a lot messing up, but then I recovered. And then you build a sense of comfortability. And Star and I was having this discussion where you've built a life of comfortability that you're not necessarily willing to give up, and that you think that certain things can't touch you, or where you have a child and you know, who was growing up in a certain way. And as Topeka mentioned, who goes to a great school, does this, and you think that, you know, even if my child gets in trouble, I have the means to get them out. And what we have seen is that when you have a Black child, it doesn't matter what means you have. Oftentimes, you cannot get them out. You cannot save them from what we know to be true, is that we all make mistakes. We all sometimes make bad decisions, and we've lost that. And we've even built a community of ourselves in judging each other. Well, they choose to be that way. And we have to look at the design. We have to look at the systematic oppression. We have to look at what's taking place. And as mentioned, as we all agree, that this is a universal problem that we have to care about. And our women, you know, like we said, the Breonna Taylor, whose officers have yet to be arrested, pass a law, but don't arrest the officer, you know, so there's a lot of things that we could talk about, but I just want to leave us thinking and paying attention to the fact that to show empathy, to show compassion, and to understand there is a greater design that is impacting us as a whole, even if you think that you've made it to the other side of the river. And that's something that I really want us to focus on. It definitely was inspiring. It's definitely made me even look at where are some things that I can be helpful at in looking at the reform of women, especially in prison, because it's something we don't talk about. I can't imagine when I was pregnant being shackled, you know, so, you know, there's a lot of different things that are taking place in this country that we have really forgotten. And so I want us to definitely make sure that we hone in on these things. Topeka, thank you so much for being a part of this. And definitely we want you to come back, and we appreciate you so much. So, and we out.